Before we travel back, let me know something small but powerful. Where are you listening from right now? And what time does your clock insist it is? Drop it in the comments. Knowing who you are and when links our two worlds together. Now, grab a blanket, settle in, maybe flick on a quiet fan so the soft hum steadies your breath. Ready? Close your eyes and step with me into another dawn. Paris, late autumn, 1799. You wake not as an ordinary citizen scrolling a glowing screen, but as a man named Napoleon Bonaparte, 30 years old, hair still dark, ambition brighter than any candle in the Tuileries Palace. Your mattress is stuffed with horsehair, not foam and pocketed springs. The fire in the marble hearth burned low overnight. Breath turns white in the chill. You ring a brass bell, no electric call buttons here, and a valet appears instantly, folding back the heavy brocade drapes so gray, light spills onto parquet floors. Breakfast? A silver pot of coffee, thick as syrup and bitter enough to jolt a general awake. Beside it, a sliver of brioche, nothing Instagram-worthy, but precious in a city still rationing bread after revolution. While you eat, aides shuffle and carrying dispatches sealed with wax, not push notifications. Your fingers break each seal. The wax cracks like brittle ice. One letter warns of royalist plots. Another begs for artillery funds. None can be postponed with a polite LOL or a snooze button. You dress in a wool uniform that scratches like nettles, slide your arm through an emerald-lined overcoat, then fasten a sword belt. The blade's weight at your hip reminds you every second that politics here still bleeds. Outside, carriages clatter over cobblestones slick with morning drizzle. Street lamps sputter out. The smell of horse manure mixes with roasting chestnuts from a vendor's brazier. Compare it to your world of traffic lights, asphalt and diesel fumes. Neither era spares the nose, yet the scents map two entirely different empires. Citizens tug their hats as you pass. They fear you, first among equals in a republic that already feels like a throne in disguise. A newspaper boy shouts headlines accusing you of dreaming of crowns. He isn't wrong, but he cannot tweet it. His voice is the press, his arm muscles the algorithm. You arrive at the Council of 500. Inside, rhetoric echoes without microphones. Lungs must project where your world leans on speakers. Papers rustle, boots scrape, passions flare. Here, a single speech can unmake constitutions. There are no term limits on ambition, only bayonets and barricades. Pause a moment. Feel the heartbeat of 1799 against your own pulse in the 21st century. Napoleon's morning, swords, wax seals, horsehair and coffee like gunpowder, already feels exhausting next to your calendar pings and insulated coffee mugs. Different tools, same hunger, control of the day. Breathe, listener. Keep your blanket close, your fan humming. Our journey with Napoleon has only begun. Napoleon Bonaparte was not born a king, nor into wealth, but into modest Corsican nobility in 1769. His early years were marked by an austere upbringing and a powerful ambition that drove him beyond his provincial roots. He didn't have the luxuries we know today. No soft beds, no screens glowing with entertainment, no grocery stores packed with abundance. He grew up with political instability, shifting identities. Corsica had only just become French, and a feeling of displacement that shaped his relentless drive for power. At just 9 years old, he was enrolled in a military academy in France. His classmates mocked his Corsican accent and modest means, but these slights only fueled his determination. While children today may struggle with school pressure, Napoleon's education was preparation for war, for command, and for a life of danger and decisions that shaped empires. By his teenage years, he was already an artillery officer. A high school senior today might be choosing a college. Napoleon was commanding cannons. But even as he rose, there were moments of quiet. Letters he wrote to Josephine show a man uncertain and longing. Beneath the armor was vulnerability, love, fear, and hope. When he gave an order, thousands lived or died. Today, most of us navigate choices about careers, education, or relationships. His choices shaped history. And yet, in his words, you find traces of humanity. He wasn't just a figure from history books. He was a man who believed he could and should change the world. During the chaos of the French Revolution, Napoleon's talents emerged quickly. At just 26, he led the French army in Italy and won astonishing victories. While most young men today are searching for identity, he was reshaping the future of Europe. His life was spent on the move, sleeping in tents, wading through rivers, enduring the cold and hunger with his troops. Modern leaders speak from podiums and screens. Napoleon led from the front, sharing the mud, the meals, and the danger. His genius was not just strategic. It was psychological. He knew when to attack, when to wait, and when to inspire. He saw patterns in chaos. He believed deeply in destiny, in stars, in signs. A blend of logic and myth lived inside him. When he invaded Egypt, it wasn't just with soldiers, but scholars and scientists. He wanted to understand as much as he wanted to conquer. And though the campaign failed militarily, it brought back knowledge, including the Rosetta Stone, and opened the door to Egyptology. Back in France, government after government fell. Napoleon returned and orchestrated a coup, becoming first consul. Eventually, he would crown himself emperor, not by birthright, but by sheer will. He did not wait to be chosen. He chose himself. As emperor, Napoleon reshaped France. The Napoleonic Code simplified and unified laws and remains the foundation for many modern legal systems. He reformed education, centralized administration, and rebuilt France's infrastructure. Yet he also restricted freedoms in the name of order. His reign was not gentle. It was effective, swift, and absolute. Power flowed from one mind, his. In contrast, modern society is built on committees, consensus, and cautious progress. Napoleon's reforms lifted merit over nobility, rewarding talent rather than lineage. In doing so, he gave hope to thousands while enforcing control. Outside France, he faced growing opposition. Europe united against him in waves, the coalitions. He won at Austerlitz, where his forces outmaneuvered a larger enemy. But even victories created enemies. His belief in destiny was unwavering. Today, we use data, forecasts, algorithms. He relied on instinct and signs, and he trusted them completely. But even rulers face personal struggles. He divorced Josephine, not from lack of love, but the need for an heir. He married into royalty, hoping to secure a dynasty, yet never forgot Josephine. Power did not shield him from heartbreak. Then came the Russian campaign, his greatest mistake. He entered with 600,000 troops. Fewer than 100,000 returned. Winter, disease, and stretched supply lines destroyed what strategy could not. He was not defeated by an army, but by nature itself. After the disastrous Russian campaign, Napoleon's enemies seized their chance. One by one, alliances formed, and he was forced to abdicate in 1814. They sent him to Elba, a small island, a tiny stage for a man who once commanded continents. But Napoleon was not content with exile. Within a year, he escaped and returned to France. The people cheered. Soldiers once sent to arrest him joined him. Paris opened its gates. Thus began the 100 Days. It was a final stand, a desperate reach to reclaim the world he once held. But history had moved forward. His enemies had learned. At Waterloo, Napoleon fought not just armies, but the turning of an era. Rain delayed his attack. Allied forces united, and despite his brilliance, he lost. This time, exile was final. He was sent to St. Helena, a lonely, windswept island in the South Atlantic. There he wrote, dictated memoirs, revised history as he wished to be remembered. He died in 1821, far from France. His last wish was to be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the people he once ruled. Years later, his body was returned to Paris. Today, he lies in a grand tomb, less a grave, more a monument to ambition. Napoleon lived as few ever have, in extremes, in triumph, ruin, love, and war. And though centuries have passed, his story still echoes, as a warning, a legend, and a mirror of human possibility. Napoleon's return from exile was not just a march, it was a resurrection. In 1815, he stepped ashore in France, alone but not forgotten. Within weeks, tens of thousands rallied to him. Soldiers who had once sworn loyalty to kings once more bent their knees to their emperor. It was not strategy that brought him back to power, it was memory, a France that remembered greatness, even if it had come at a cost. News spread like fire. As he marched north, people lined the roads. They brought bread, wine, cheers, and old flags hidden for years. The tricolor, once banned, fluttered freely again. The king fled. Napoleon entered Paris without a battle. Yet, the world had changed. The coalitions reformed. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. They would not allow his empire to rise again. And so, in 100 days, he prepared for one final gamble. At Waterloo, he faced the Duke of Wellington and Prussian forces under Blücher. Rain fell the night before, turning fields into mud. Cannons sank. Horses struggled. Napoleon delayed his attack, a fatal hesitation. His forces fought bravely. Marshal Ney charged again and again, and the Old Guard, Napoleon's finest, held the line. But the Prussians arrived. The French line broke. The imperial dream collapsed in the mud. He fled again, this time not as a hero, but a relic. He surrendered to the British and was sent to St. Helena. There, surrounded by rock and sea, the man who had once redrawn the map of Europe now watched the tides. No grand armies, no marches, just wind, water, and memories. On St. Helena, Napoleon was not a general, not a ruler, just a prisoner with too much time. The British assigned guards, limited visitors, and monitored letters. They feared not the man, but his legend. Days were long. He walked in the garden, wrote memoirs, dictated thoughts. He tried to shape how the world would remember him. He spoke often of destiny, of misunderstood genius, of betrayal by allies. The island, though small, echoed with the voice of empire. Illness came slowly. Stomach pains, fatigue. Some say poison, others cancer. But suffering was constant. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon died. Far from Paris, far from war, far from glory. He was buried under a simple stone. Years later, his body was returned to France, to Les Invalides. There, beneath a great dome, lies the man who crowned himself emperor. Not by lineage, not by divine right, but by force, brilliance, and audacity. And though the empire he built did not endure, his legacy did. Streets, cities, and systems bear his name. His image stands in marble, bronze, and memory. Few men change the course of nations. Fewer still change the rhythm of history. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of them. What separates Napoleon from us today is not just power, it is purpose. In an age without smartphones, without electricity, without global networks, he built an identity that spanned continents. He lived in a world ruled by letters and couriers, but moved with the speed of vision. He acted, not reacted. He believed, even when others doubted. And he built laws, schools, roads, reputations. Today, our lives are filled with choices, but often empty of direction. Napoleon's life was filled with consequence. Each decision echoed through time. His sleep was short, his appetite measured, his mind relentless. He demanded excellence, expected sacrifice, and offered glory. He was not a kind ruler. He was a brilliant one. And while most of us will never command armies or redraw borders, we do share one thing: time. What we do with it defines us. Napoleon used his time to climb from obscurity to immortality. His story is not just of empire, but of ambition unleashed. And in that, he remains closer to us than we think. Imagine standing beside Napoleon not on the battlefield, but in the quiet of his study. The hour is late. Candles flicker. Maps sprawl across the table like silent witnesses to ambition. His fingers trace borders, not of lands, but of ideas. He dreams not just of conquest, but of control. Not chaos, but order. For in every campaign, every decree, there was a thread of purpose, to reshape the world into a reflection of his will. He was not content with winning wars. He wanted to win minds. The Napoleonic Code, still echoed in many nations, was his attempt to bring reason to law. It standardized justice, made it portable, reproducible, like a kind of civil software, a template of governance, modern for its time. Now picture our own world, full of apps and algorithms, yet often paralyzed by indecision. Napoleon's decisions were swift. He would listen, deliberate, then act. And once he acted, he never hesitated. His strength came from his clarity, not just of vision, but of self. There's something hypnotic about a person who believes fully in their destiny. We admire it, even if we fear it. Napoleon didn't stumble into power, he chased it. With every word, every move, he rehearsed his legacy. He said, "Great ambition is the passion of a great character," and that ambition wasn't random. It had direction, purpose. Today, we change jobs, cities, even beliefs, looking for purpose. Napoleon forged his. Even in exile, even on the edge of the known world, his sense of destiny never faded. There's a story from St. Helena. One day, while looking out at the Atlantic, he said, "France will call for me again." It didn't. But it didn't matter. His confidence didn't depend on validation. It was self-generated, absolute. That's the difference. He built the myth while he lived, not waiting for history to do it for him. That myth, for better or worse, still walks beside us in every leadership seminar, every political strategy, every movement that believes one person can change everything. As modern people, we often measure greatness by popularity, by followers, by likes. But Napoleon lived in a world where greatness meant something else: permanence. A legacy that outlasted the body, that etched itself into stone and story. He sought not fame, but immortality. Consider his relationships, with Josephine, with his marshals, with his enemies. They were not casual, they were strategic, layered. He could love, but he loved with conditions. He trusted few and watched everyone. In many ways, Napoleon was both lion and fox, ferocious in battle, cunning in court. He would pace before decisions, speak rapidly when inspired, and could memorize entire texts with ease. He slept little, planned obsessively, and surrounded himself with brilliance and submission. His genius wasn't accidental. It was cultivated, sharpened like a blade. Today, we're taught to balance life, work, rest, leisure. Napoleon had no such luxury. His life was war, even in peace. His rest came only in surrender, and even then, his mind never ceased. He studied history, learned from Caesar, admired Alexander, but he wasn't content to be like them. He wanted to surpass them. And that's what separates him from the civilian life most of us know. We live reactively. He lived intentionally. Every gesture was a performance, every decision a page in his mythos. He wore the uniform even when no battle was near. He walked with a pace that demanded space. He didn't just command armies, he commanded attention. In our world, filled with distractions, Napoleon reminds us what undivided focus can become. His life was a cathedral of effort, built brick by brick with obsession and daring. We may not want to live like him, but we can't help but look. Because in his life, we glimpse a kind of fire, one that refuses to dim, even across the centuries. Let's step back for a moment and imagine the world Napoleon was born into. It was 1769. Corsica had just been taken by France from Genoa. The Enlightenment buzzed across Europe, yet kings still ruled by divine right, and power came from heritage, not merit. Napoleon was not born into privilege. He was the second son of a modest noble family, technically aristocracy, but without wealth or influence. His father, Napoleon Bonaparte, secured Napoleon a scholarship to the French Military Academy, a path most Corsicans would never dream of. From a young age, he was different, introspective, proud, isolated. His Corsican accent and outsider status made him a target for ridicule among Parisian elites. But he turned humiliation into drive. Where others sought comfort, he pursued discipline. Picture a teenager in cold stone barracks, studying Caesar, memorizing artillery manuals, writing impassioned essays about liberty and war. While other boys learned to fence and flatter, Napoleon learned to endure. Today, a student's struggles might be eased by support systems, social networks, wellness apps. For Napoleon, there was no such cushion. His resilience was forged through isolation and challenge. As a young officer, he was often posted in quiet garrisons, but he never wasted time. He read endlessly: history, philosophy, geography. He wrote political pamphlets, drafted battle plans, studied how men moved and how they broke. He saw patterns in chaos. Where others saw scattered reports, he saw a strategy. Where others waited for orders, he acted. That independence was risky. It made him enemies. But it also made him indispensable. During the siege of Toulon, he proposed a bold artillery maneuver. It worked. He turned the tide. For the first time, the military recognized what was brewing, not just talent, but something more, a storm dressed in uniform. That moment made him a brigadier general at just 24. In a time when birth dictated destiny, Napoleon carved a path with merit and will. And from that day on, he believed he was born for something extraordinary. Now let's talk about ambition, not as a desire, but as a force, a gravitational pull. For Napoleon, ambition was not a goal, it was his nature. He didn't want a seat at the table. He wanted to redesign the table itself. After the French Revolution, the nation was in disarray. Kings were gone. Blood had run in the streets. Power was shifting, uncertain. This was the perfect storm for a man who saw opportunity where others saw danger. When he took command of the army of Italy in 1796, it was demoralized and underfed. Within weeks he transformed it, not by magic, but by momentum. He led from the front, learned soldiers' names, and offered them vision. He said, "Soldiers, you are naked and ill-fed. The government owes you much, but can give you nothing. I am leading you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and riches." And they followed him. Campaign after campaign, Napoleon didn't just win. He shattered assumptions. He moved faster than others thought possible. He ignored traditional battle doctrine. He improvised, surprised, overwhelmed. He took Milan, then marched through the Alps to confront Austrian forces in bold, daring maneuvers that felt almost cinematic. And when he returned to Paris, he was more than a general. He was a national hero. People saw in him what they had lost in the revolution: order, brilliance, hope. It's easy now, from the safety of history, to question him, to see him as just another conqueror. But in that moment, in that broken, breathless France, Napoleon felt like a miracle. A mind with direction, a man with conviction. And we, living in a world of fractured attention and fleeting trends, can still be struck by how rare that kind of focus is. Napoleon's rise wasn't luck. It was relentless purpose. And it had only just begun. Let's imagine the Paris Napoleon returned to, a city worn by revolution, unsteady with uncertainty. The Directory governed in name, but corruption thrived. There were factions, plots, fear. The people longed for stability, and Napoleon offered more than that. He offered control. In 1799, he orchestrated a coup. Not with bloodshed, but with speed. He entered the political halls not as a soldier, but as a savior. He dissolved the Directory and emerged as first consul. And then he got to work. Unlike most military leaders, Napoleon didn't just rule from above. He reorganized law, stabilized the currency, and negotiated peace. He restructured education, centralized administration, and even allowed some exiled nobles to return. The Napoleonic Code, his legal framework, was clear, secular, and revolutionary in its simplicity. It protected property, promoted meritocracy, and gave structure to chaos. Think of it this way. While today we rely on legal systems that evolved slowly, Napoleon created one in years that influenced centuries. He governed with clarity, precision, and speed. Ministers were expected to deliver results, not excuses. Meetings were brief, decisions final. There was no bureaucracy for bureaucracy's sake. Every structure was meant to function like his army, efficient, responsive, unified. Yet power, once seized, rarely stopped seeking. In 1804, the Republic ended in name. Napoleon crowned himself emperor, literally. In the Cathedral of Notre Dame, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. That act said everything. His authority came not from God, not from lineage, but from himself. He believed that he was France, that his rule was not tyranny, but destiny. And in that moment, Europe trembled again. What separates Napoleon from most modern figures isn't just his ambition, it's how he wielded power with clarity of intent. In an age before computers, before mass surveillance, before instant communication, he governed a vast empire as if it were a single machine. Every policy, every decree had purpose. There was no confusion in Napoleon's vision. He didn't believe in slow reform or endless debate. He believed in force, in decision, in momentum. Compare that to today's world, where leaders navigate polls, public opinion, complex coalitions. Napoleon had no patience for such caution. His rule was direct, brutal at times, but always intentional. His Europe wasn't built with consent, it was carved with cannon fire. And yet, inside that empire, he built roads, ports, institutions. He abolished feudalism in many territories, encouraged science, and elevated the middle class. He believed in progress, but on his terms. To the people of France, especially the peasantry and the rising bourgeoisie, he was stability. To monarchs across Europe, he was contagion, the spread of merit, the fall of privilege. So, they rallied. Again, the coalitions returned. Britain funded them, Austria armed them, and Prussia watched carefully. Napoleon responded the only way he knew, through action. At Austerlitz, he defeated the Russians and Austrians in one of history's most brilliant battles. He used fog and terrain, misdirection and timing. His enemies thought they saw weakness. What they found was precision. In just a few hours, he shattered two empires. It wasn't magic, it was mastery. And yet, with every victory, the pressure grew. He wasn't just building an empire, he was challenging the very idea of monarchy, and Europe would not forgive him for it. Victory breeds appetite. After Austerlitz, Napoleon turned his gaze west and south. Spain became the next frontier of order by force. He installed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne, believing blood ties and bold decrees would tame a fiercely independent land. He miscalculated. Madrid erupted, villages rebelled, monks preached revolt from pulpits. Guerrilla fighters, irregulars who knew every ravine and goat path, battered French columns then vanished into olive groves. It was asymmetric warfare before textbooks named it. Napoleon could crush armies in open battle, but struggled against shadows. The Peninsular War dragged on, draining coffers, morale, and manpower. British troops under Wellington landed in Portugal, stitching local insurgents into a lethal patchwork. Every French victory felt hollow. Every kilometer gained cost gold and goodwill. While Napoleon forged ahead in Central Europe, Iberia bled him slowly, relentlessly. Yet he believed momentum would rescue him. In 1812, he amassed the Grande Armée, over 600,000 souls, from Paris to Warsaw. The target, Russia. He promised generals a campaign of weeks, a triumph to eclipse all others. Diplomats begged caution, quartermasters warned of distance, meteorologists, if they existed, would have whispered of snow. Napoleon listened only to destiny. They crossed the Niemen River in summer heat, uniforms bright, standards gleaming. Town after town fell, yet the Russians refused decisive battle, retreating, torching crops, denying forage. By the time Napoleon reached a smoldering Moscow, winter's first breath had already iced the ponds. The city burned behind him, supplies dwindled ahead, and still he waited for surrender that never came. When snow closed the roads, the Emperor of Momentum ordered retreat. Frost replaced bullets. Starvation outpaced sabers. Horses died first, then men. Boots cracked, fingers blackened. Discipline dissolved into desperate marches across white deserts littered with cannon too heavy to drag. At the Berezina River, pontoon bridges collapsed beneath fleeing masses. Soldiers flung themselves onto ice floes. Artillerymen abandoned guns in fear. Those who crossed carried trauma that even glory could not bleach away. Less than a sixth of the Grande Armée staggered back into Poland, ghosts wrapped in rags, eyes hollow as the steps. News of disaster raced through Europe. Monarchs who once trembled now gathered courage. Prussia switched allegiance, Austria hedged bets, and Britain poured gold into a new coalition. Napoleon raised fresh armies, boys and reservists, but something vital had frozen in Russia and never thawed: the myth of invincibility. From Madrid's narrow streets to Moscow's scorched mansions, resistance had learned Napoleon's secret. His genius was real but not eternal. Like all storms, he could be endured. And when storms pass, the rubble remembers. 1813 opened with cannon smoke in Saxony. Napoleon fought the Battle of Leipzig, the battle of the nations against Russians, Prussians, Austrians, Swedes. 3 days of mud, blood, and collapsing alliances. French lines bent, broke, reformed, but numbers told the story. Europe had learned cooperation. Retreat followed, then a defense of France itself. Villagers who once cheered the emperor now feared invasion. Conscripts marched with patched uniforms, drummers little older than the drumsticks they beat. Paris fell in spring, 1814. Marshals urged abdication. The Senate deposed its own hero. Napoleon signed away the throne at Fontainebleau, smashing a mirror in grief, then attempted suicide with poison, expired, ineffective like his dream. Exile to Elba seemed anticlimax, yet he governed that tiny island with the same fever he had given to empires, reforming schools, roads, orchards. Still, the continent's heartbeat called. 10 months later, he sailed with a handful of grenadiers, landing near Caen. Soldiers sent to arrest him listened to a single speech, then joined the march. Within 3 weeks, he entered Paris to thunderous adoration. 100 days of renewed reign began, astonishing, alarming. But destiny's accounts demanded closure. Waterloo met him with rain, mistimed attacks, and Wellington's endurance. Prussian columns under Blücher sealed the fate. When the old guard broke under grapeshot, the spell that had bound Europe for 2 decades shattered. His second abdication was quieter, almost routine. Hoping for asylum in Britain, he instead found confinement on St. Helena, an Atlantic speck ruled by wind and salt. There, stripped of titles, he cultivated narrative. He dictated memoirs, blamed traitors, pondered fate. Even in defeat, he shaped memory, editing history like a sculptor chiseling marble. Fast forward 2 centuries. We live in algorithmic kingdoms, ruled not by emperors, but by attention. Yet Napoleon's pulse still echoes. Military academies study his maneuvers. Leaders quote his maxims. Dreamers borrow his certainty. He reminds us that one life, ablaze with conviction, can redraw maps, geographic and mental. But his downfall offers equal lesson. Momentum without humility courts ruin. Vision untempered by empathy invites revolt. No data set is needed to see that the harder he gripped Europe, the faster it dissolved through his fingers. The curtain falls on the emperor, but the stage remains. History waits for new actors, new scripts. The question echoes from St. Helena's cliffs to the glow of your screen. When destiny calls, will we seek crowns, or will we craft something gentler, empires of understanding rather than conquest? The musket smoke has cleared, the cannons are silent, yet Napoleon's imprint on daily life endures in quieter ways than armies and anthems. Consider the Napoleonic Code. Passed in 1804, it swept away a labyrinth of medieval laws and local customs, replacing them with a single lucid text. Property rights became clear, contracts enforceable, civil marriage standardized, and the notion of merit rather than birth entered the bloodstream of modern governance. Today, echoes of that code still steer courtrooms from Paris to Quebec, from Brussels to Buenos Aires. Whenever you sign a lease, register a patent, or defend your privacy in many civil law nations, you are walking paths first paved by Napoleon's lawyers. Not emperors in uniforms, but clerks in candlelit rooms, articulating liberty, equality, and fraternity into clauses and subarticles. His reforms reached beyond law. He founded the lycée system that still educates French teenagers. He created the Bank of France, stabilizing a currency once shredded by revolution. He introduced the Legion of Honor, a secular knighthood rewarding talent over pedigree. He finished the Canal de l'Ourcq, bringing fresh water into Paris. Infrastructure was strategy. Good roads speed armies, yes, but they also bind citizens, move grain, carry letters, cementing central authority through convenience. Even measurement bowed to his will. The metric system, meters, liters, kilograms, spread under his empire because war needs standard calibers, and taxation loves predictable weights. 2 centuries later, astronauts gauge orbits and pharmacists mix vaccines in units. Napoleon standardized amid battle plans. Yet every coin has its reverse. Napoleon's France thrived on conscription. The levée en masse filled regiments, but emptied villages of sons. His censorship muzzled dissenting presses. Secret police shadowed intellectuals. The continental system, aimed at strangling British trade, also strangled French merchants when smuggling surged and colonial goods vanished from markets. And everywhere his flags advanced, they sowed seeds of nationalism. Italians, Germans, Poles saw French occupation and learned paradoxical lessons. The language of modern liberty and the urge to claim their own nationhood, sometimes against France itself. The 19th century's revolutions were midwifed by a Corsican who never meant to birth rivals. So when you open a map and see countries aligned by identity, when you file taxes in decimal currency, when civil law quotes articles numbered with brevity, remember the man who dreamed of empire yet delivered blueprints for administration. His battles ended in mud, but his paperwork lives on your desk. History's thunder often fades, leaving only the architecture of ordinary days. Legacy is a restless ghost. After Napoleon died on St. Helena, his legend slipped anchor and drifted far beyond Europe. Romantic poets made him a titan felled by fate. Painters cast him against sunsets, cloak billowing like destiny's flag. Composers stitched his name into sonatas, and revolutionaries from Mexico to Greece whispered Bonaparte as code for possibility. In 1840, France demanded his remains. A black funeral barge floated down the Seine, cannons boomed, and 1 million Parisians lined the river. Old soldiers in threadbare greatcoats, students in gray capes, widows clutching violets. They didn't mourn a tyrant, they mourned lost grandeur, the audacity to think one mind might reshape the world. Bonapartism did not expire with its namesake. His nephew rode nostalgia to become Napoleon III, birthing the Second Empire and remaking Paris with boulevards wide enough to deter barricades. Across the Atlantic, Latin American liberators cited Napoleon's meritocracy as proof that new republics could eclipse colonial hierarchies. Even Vladimir Lenin kept a bust of Napoleon on his desk, warning his comrades that revolutionary fire can brand or burn, depending on discipline. Yet cautionary tales shadow the admiration. Historians count the dead, 3 million across 2 decades of Napoleonic wars. Cities starved under blockades, families shattered by conscription, cultures bent to imperial vanity. His life asks an unsettling question: how much brilliance justifies how much suffering? Fast forward to now. We build digital empires with profiles and podcasts. We wage culture wars in comment threads, measure influence in followers, craft personal brands with algorithms as marshals. In that arena, Napoleon feels eerily contemporary, master of narrative, curator of image, amplifier of self. But we also possess hindsight he lacked, the knowledge that speed without restraint can detonate progress. So what do we do with his ghost? We study his campaigns to learn agility, his reforms to learn structure, his downfall to learn humility. We remember that a single human can accelerate history, and that history eventually collects its debts. The next time you set goals, whether launching a company, writing a book, or simply planning a year, hear the distant hoofbeats of the Grande Armée. Feel the thrill of possibility, but also the chill of caution. Ask, is my ambition building roads or merely marching troops? Will my code of conduct outlive my victories? Will the people in my story choose loyalty or endure it? Napoleon's final lesson is neither glory nor doom, but responsibility. Power is temporary, paperwork permanent, and the world always keeps the receipts. Strip away the medals, titles, and victories, and Napoleon becomes a man, restless, private, and strangely fragile. He was not the cold-blooded commander of propaganda posters. He feared cats. He wore cologne excessively. His handwriting was illegible, his spelling erratic. And in intimate moments, he oscillated between romantic devotion and imperial detachment. His first love, Josephine, was older, poised, and socially brilliant, everything young Bonaparte lacked. He wrote her letters filled with longing, obsession, and awkward charm. "I awake full of you," he penned once. "Your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures leave no rest to my senses." Yet he later divorced her, not for lack of love, but for lack of an heir. He married Marie-Louise of Austria, securing both alliance and child. She bore him a son, Napoleon II, called the King of Rome. That child would never rule. His empire was a cradle rocked by cannons, and childhood passed under distant ceilings. Napoleon's household was ruled by order. He woke early, around 5 a.m. He bathed often, paced constantly, and preferred boiled potatoes to rich meals. He worked in bursts, dictating to secretaries who could barely keep up. When planning campaigns, he memorized every road, river, and bridge on a map, recalling geography the way others recall birthdays. Yet for all his control, his health was fickle. He suffered migraines, stomach cramps, and fits of melancholy. He was both the hammer and the anvil, unstoppable in ambition, yet vulnerable in body. He distrusted doctors, dismissed spiritual advisors, and kept his circle tight. Only a few ever saw him truly relaxed, reading histories of Caesar, walking alone in gardens, stroking the dogs he allowed in his study. The man who moved armies with a glance also cried at operas. He loved Ossian's poetry, wept at Homer's Iliad, and commissioned art with mythological themes. This contradiction, cold steel wrapped in mythic longing, defines him. It's easy to think of him as stone, but he bled, doubted, and grieved. He was shaped by loss as much as victory, and in that, perhaps, he was not so different from the rest of us. Imagine transplanting Napoleon into our time. Would his genius thrive in boardrooms instead of battlefields? Would he lead a startup or a superpower? Today, we move through a world of access, where knowledge is indexed, advice live-streamed, and anonymity porous. Would he revel in that, or recoil? In his day, information moved at the pace of hooves and ink. He valued secrecy. Orders were hand-delivered. Time delays were strategic. Rumors shaped politics more than fact. In our digital storm, where tweets can sink companies and truth competes with virality, Napoleon might have drowned or mastered it entirely. He curated every portrait, posed every pose, managed his myth. Today, that instinct is called branding. His face appeared on coins, statues, banners. Modern influencers do the same, not with bronze, but pixels. Yet where he measured power and distance, how far he could march, how many borders he could cross, we measure it in attention. Clicks, shares, metrics. We don't conquer land, we conquer timelines. And unlike his centralized empires, our kingdoms are fractured. One person, one screen, one feed. He believed in meritocracy, but enforced hierarchy. We believe in freedom, but often submit to algorithms. He was accountable only to himself and history. We are accountable to everything all the time, to laws, to peers, to data trails we can't erase. Napoleon lived with consequence in every breath. One wrong order cost thousands. One delay changed nations. Today, our actions seem smaller, but accumulate silently. We rarely notice the wars we wage, against time, against distraction, against meaning. If he lived now, perhaps he wouldn't seek territory, but clarity. In a time of endless noise, he might crave silence. In a world of abundance, he might prize focus. In the age of constant choice, he might envy the simplicity of marching toward a single star. What separates Napoleon from us may not be ambition, but friction. He lived in a world where every goal costs something real. We live in one where effort feels optional until we discover it's not. Napoleon did not just change maps, he changed minds. And yet, the minds he faced were not always enemies. Often they were rivals. To understand Napoleon, we must understand those who stood opposite him, not merely as obstacles, but as mirrors. The Duke of Wellington, for instance, a soldier, a statesman, and unlike Napoleon, coldly aristocratic. He fought for order, not revolution. He won at Waterloo not through brilliance, but through steadiness, discipline, and the arrival of allies. Where Napoleon was heat, Wellington was stone. Then there was Tsar Alexander I, unpredictable, idealistic, enigmatic. At times, he admired Napoleon. At others, he feared him. Their relationship began with treaties and admiration, and ended in burning cities and betrayal. And Metternich, the Austrian diplomat who outlived them all. While Napoleon raised empires through war, Metternich restored Europe with ink. His Congress of Vienna rebuilt Europe by balancing power, forging fragile peace after 2 decades of thunder. These figures reveal something profound, that every force invites resistance. Napoleon's rise wasn't just a story of victory, it provoked a story of coalition, of kings and states banding together to stop one man from rewriting history too fast. Today, we face something similar, not in the form of armies, but of ideas. We idolize speed, disruption, innovation, but every disruption creates instability. Napoleon moved faster than the world could tolerate. He expanded before Europe was ready to be reshaped. His fall wasn't just due to defeat, it was exhaustion. Europe could not keep pace with his ambition. In our world, we sometimes reward the same, the innovators, the disruptors, the visionaries. But like Napoleon, when they push too far, backlash follows. Regulation, resistance, rest. Napoleon's enemies remind us, change needs roots. Not just motion, but meaning. Not just direction, but durability. In a way, his enemies preserved the memory of balance, and that is why we remember both sides. Not just the conqueror, but those who held the line. Let's look closer now at legacy. Not the legacy of battles or treaties, but something quieter. How Napoleon's world shaped ours, often without us noticing. When you see a last name pass from father to son, and not a family crest, that's Napoleonic. When your nation runs on written laws instead of oral tradition or royal decree, that's Napoleonic. When your country believes in merit, however imperfectly, over birthright, you're feeling the ripple of an empire that tried to systematize talent. The Napoleonic Code is perhaps the greatest monument he left. It wasn't a statue or a throne. It was a framework for property, civil rights, contracts, marriage. He simplified law, removed feudal clutter, and made justice, if not always fair, at least readable. Schools, secular, organized, rigorous, owe much to Napoleon. He created lycées, standardized curriculums, made the state a teacher. He didn't just want obedient citizens. He wanted capable officers, engineers, administrators. His empire was built on knowledge, not just nationalism. And passports, yes, those little books we carried to cross borders? Napoleon expanded them. Before him, travel was local, informal, tribal. After him, identity became formal. The state knew who you were, could track you, authorize you. Modern bureaucracy, so often frustrating yet foundational, owes him a debt. He believed in systems, hierarchy, record-keeping, even conscription, which drafted soldiers by number rather than social rank, democratized sacrifice, if not completely. In a strange twist, the man who crowned himself emperor did more to dismantle the old aristocracy than most revolutionaries. He replaced noble blood with function, ritual with role. And so, even if his empire fell, its scaffolding endured. In France, in Belgium, in parts of Italy, Spain, and Latin America. And not just in law, in culture, in memory, in story. You see, Napoleon built two legacies, one of conquest, which died, and one of systems, which lived. It is easier to remember the battles, harder to recognize the policies, but it is those policies that live in our daily routines, in courtrooms, classrooms, and citizenship forms. Step inside Napoleon's mind and you find neither chaos nor calm, but a spinning gyroscope always seeking balance. He examined life like a chessboard, terrain, timing, talent. No square was accidental. Everything served momentum. Before battles, he did not sleep. He rehearsed. Aides heard him pacing the parquet floors, murmuring questions no one could answer but himself. How wide is that river? How firm is that soil? How long will dawn hide the sun? He mapped days in half hours. At 5, he woke to thick coffee. By 6, dispatches were answered, never later. If you want to take Vienna, he told his staff, take Vienna. To him, hesitation was treason against potential. Most of us consider possibilities. He computed probabilities, then acted as if certainty were already signed. His notebooks, many still survive, show pages of frantic scrawls, supply figures, bridge widths, population counts, Latin quotations. Margins crawl with arrows pointing to next steps. Even leisure was scheduled. At the opera he timed scene changes, measuring public patience. Rest was a tactic. He napped on horseback between artillery salvos, waking to issue orders sharper than men fully rested. In Italy, 1796, his headquarters moved daily. Enemy generals complained they could never locate him. French officers joked that Bonaparte dined in Verona, breakfasted in Milan, and lunched somewhere between. Speed was thought made flesh. He once wrote, "The moral is to the physical as 3 is to 1, meaning, break spirit first, body follows. He wielded stories like weapons. Before Marengo, he told troops the Austrians feared French bayonets more than French bullets. Before Austerlitz, he let enemy scouts spy foe weakness on his right flank, baiting them into the valley where fog pooled like ambush cloth. He bent perception to craft reality, turning rumor into raw material. Inside his head, history conversed with geography. He compared every ridge to Caesar's Gaul, every siege to Alexander's Tyre. If Caesar succeeded with 10 legions, Napoleon asked how he might win with 8. Constraint sharpened strategy. Modern leaders iterate in sprints. He iterated in battles where miscalculation bled cities dry. Yet for all the steel, there was softness, an almost childlike curiosity. Crossing the Alps, he stopped to measure echo length inside a cavern. In Egypt, he studied desert mirages, guessing at refraction angles. He wanted to know how the world worked so he could decide where to break it. That is his mental blueprint. Gather data with obsession, compress into vision, launch before doubt. He lived in the fraction of a second between insight and execution. Few can follow there. Most live in analysis or aftermath. Napoleon dwelt in the hinge. Obstacles to Napoleon were narratives waiting for revision. He believed every barrier contained a pivot if angled correctly. Take the siege of Toulon. He arrived a junior officer. Senior commanders dismissed his plan to seize key artillery positions. He appealed directly to facts, range tables, wind direction, harbor layout, data over rank. When his strategy earned victory, he leapfrogged careers in an afternoon. Lesson: prove with results, not rhetoric. Or consider the 18 Brumaire coup. Legislators shrieked, "Outlaw!" Guns were raised in the council chamber. He nearly fainted under the din. Yes, the rum Corsican almost swooned. But an instant later he pivoted, called in grenadiers, evacuated deputies, reframed chaos as necessity. Within hours, the republic ended and the consulate began. Lesson: if the room turns against you, change the room. Spain was different. Guerrillas gnawed his flanks. Wellington's shadow boxed him into stalemate. Instead of stubbornly reinforcing forever, he delegated to marshals who lacked his spark. That misread cost him years. Even in genius, blind spots linger. Lesson: delegation without alignment breeds entropy. His greatest obstacle, however, was climate. Russian winter. He knew distances, forgot seasons. During retreat he improvised, ordered cavalry to ride ahead of infantry to pack snow into smoother roads, instructed smiths to nail horseshoes crosswise for better ice grip. Innovation without raw materials rarely suffices. Lesson: environment is an adversary that never signs treaties. On St. Helena, his prison island, obstacles turned inward. Monotony, diminishing health. British Governor Hudson Lowe restricted books, censored letters. Napoleon countered with memory, recounting battles to secretaries, crafting memoirs that would outlive walls. He converted isolation into printing press. Lesson: when motion is denied, turn narrative into movement. What can modern listeners steal from these maneuvers? Reframe delays as data gathering. Leverage speed but anchor in preparation. When hierarchy blocks progress, prototype proof. Treat context, weather, market, culture, as a living rival. If exiled from action, write the story others will quote. Napoleon's obstacles were cannons and continents. Ours may be inboxes and inertia. The scale differs, the pivot remains. He teaches that strategy is less about overpowering resistance and more about rerouting energy, moment by moment, sentence by sentence, until the obstacle forgets it was ever immovable. To command millions is one kind of burden. To be known by millions yet truly understood by none, that is lonelier still. Napoleon often stood surrounded, yet solitary. His generals respected him. His people idolized him. But few knew how deeply he feared irrelevance. After every campaign, after every coronation, a silence lingered. Victory echoed, but only briefly. Then came the need to plan again, to build again, to avoid the stillness where doubt crept in. He did not merely fear defeat, he feared becoming unimportant. In letters to Josephine, before their relationship soured, he wrote of longing and vulnerability. I awaken full of you. Your image and the memory of last night leave no rest to my senses. For a man painted in marble and glory, these moments reveal a pulse beneath the armor. Yet even love was political. He divorced Josephine not out of malice, but calculation. She bore him no heir. France needed a dynasty. So he married Marie-Louise of Austria, a royal alliance once unthinkable for the child of Corsican nobility. He hoped for affection, but settled for symbolism. In court, he demanded loyalty, but rarely gave intimacy. He kept people at strategic distances, never too close to become indispensable. He said, men are more easily governed through their vices than through their virtues. This wasn't cynicism. It was how he survived. He trusted few. Talleyrand betrayed him with elegance. Fouché played both sides. Even his brothers disappointed him, too ambitious or too weak. He once remarked, "My family is a burden I carry like a cross." Fame elevated him, but also distorted. In public, he was a myth. In private, he was a man searching for mirrors that did not lie. On campaign, he craved letters, not dispatches, but personal words. They anchored him to a world beyond maps and marches. When Josephine stopped writing, he panicked, not as a commander, but as a husband. In St. Helena's final years, he reread those letters. He annotated them, corrected their dates, even commented on the handwriting. Every margin was a memory. To the world, he had been emperor. To himself, perhaps, he was always the boy from Ajaccio who wanted to matter. And maybe that's what separates him, not just his ambition, but the aching need to have that ambition seen, remembered, and never misunderstood. Power for Napoleon was not a throne or a crown. It was momentum. He was not content to rule. He needed to reshape, redirect, rewrite the world. His reforms were not afterthoughts. They were artillery in another form. In the span of just a few years, he laid down the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that still underpins law across Europe. He centralized administration, reformed taxation, expanded education, and built infrastructure, not as charity, but as scaffolding for an empire that could outlive him. He believed deeply in merit. Every soldier carries a marshal's baton in his knapsack, he said. In his world, titles came not by birth, but by performance. Generals rose from the ranks. Officials were promoted on effectiveness, not lineage. But this system demanded constant motion. As soon as something was built, he asked how it might be improved, expanded, replicated. The moment of rest was never permitted to linger. Even religion, once a tool of monarchy, he co-opted. He restored Catholicism in France, but under state control. He signed the Concordat with the Pope, yet later crowned himself in Notre Dame, taking the crown from the pontiff's hands. It was not rebellion, it was choreography. Symbol mattered. He ruled by imagery as much as decree. In diplomacy, he redrew borders with ink and bayonets, client states, puppet kingdoms, imposed monarchs with French blood. He called it the Grand Empire. Others called it overreach. What's remarkable is how comprehensively he restructured life. Before Napoleon, conscription was rare. He normalized it. Before him, surnames were optional for many citizens. He required them for civil records. He even dictated how streets should be numbered. His vision was order, but one built atop volatility. It worked only so long as he kept winning. When victory slowed, that structure showed cracks. Without momentum, the center wobbled. Modern administrations take decades to achieve less. He did it in under 10 years. Not through committees, but through command. He listened, but ultimately decided. And though many of his reforms were rolled back after his fall, the deeper architecture remained. Even enemies admitted as much. The Prussian military copied his strategies. Austrian legalists studied his code. The world that tried to stop him also quietly adopted pieces of him. This is what separates men who rule from men who shape. Rulers leave successors. Shapers leave frameworks. Napoleon built blueprints for a continent and scattered them like seeds in both conquest and collapse. To truly understand Napoleon, one must understand how he thought, not just what he did. His mind was a battlefield long before his soldiers marched across one. He organized thoughts the way he arranged armies, swiftly, strategically, always looking 10 moves ahead. He described sleep as a brief interruption, not a necessity. He wrote memos at 3 in the morning, dictated plans before sunrise, and reviewed correspondence as others stirred from bed. His mind did not wander, it conquered. When asked how he made decisions, he once said, "I see the situation. I identify the objective, and then I cut through all noise." It wasn't arrogance, it was clarity. Where others hesitated, he advanced. Where councils debated, he acted. His philosophy was steeped in Enlightenment ideals, but sharpened by military necessity. He admired Voltaire, studied Caesar, quoted Machiavelli. He didn't seek power for its own sake. He sought to prove what a single human will could achieve. Obstacles to him were not discouragements, they were instruments of greatness. The harsher the terrain, the greater the triumph. He crossed the Alps not because it was wise, but because it was bold. He attacked when defense was expected. He maneuvered when others stood still. He believed fortune favored the daring, but only if they prepared endlessly. His campaigns were not improvised chaos. They were calculated storms. Maps, timetables, and intelligence reports filled his quarters. He visualized battles before they began, rehearsed variables in his mind like a symphony. Yet his genius was not flawless. His certainty bred risk. In Russia, he underestimated distance, weather, and resistance. His belief that boldness always won failed against the land that swallowed armies whole. But even in failure, his intellectual framework remained potent. His resilience came not from optimism, but adaptation. After a defeat, he asked why, not who. After a retreat, he restructured. The world saw collapse. He saw recalibration. This mindset is foreign to most of us. Today, hesitation is normal. We have luxuries of delay, of deferral. Napoleon had none. He learned to make decisions not when he felt ready, but when time demanded them. In that way, his mind remains a model, not for conquest, but for conviction. For the idea that belief, preparation, and velocity, when aligned, can move mountains, or empires. Power, for Napoleon, wasn't just about control, it was about transformation. He didn't want to simply reign over France. He wanted to reshape its soul, to turn revolution into stability, chaos into code. His vision of leadership went beyond kingship. Kings inherited, Napoleon invented. Where monarchs wore crowns, he wore ambition. He built institutions like a master craftsman, each part designed to outlast him. The Bank of France, civil administration, the educational lycée system, all born not from tradition, but necessity. His philosophy was simple. A state must be organized, or it will be overthrown by its own confusion. In education, he saw the future. He demanded schools to produce loyal, skilled citizens, not aristocrats, but civil servants, engineers, teachers, men who could hold a pen with as much discipline as a rifle. His bureaucracy was efficient, even ruthless. He cut through noble privilege, replacing names with metrics. Positions were earned. Results mattered. France became less feudal, more functional. Yet, for all this modernity, he was no democrat. He believed in guided order. Liberty, yes, but structured. Equality, but within hierarchy. To him, democracy was too fragile, too slow. His rule was fast, decisive, and often unilateral. In this paradox, liberator and autocrat, lies the complexity of Napoleon. He freed men from kings, then asked them to kneel to an emperor. He broke chains, only to forge a different set. And yet, millions followed. Why? Because he offered something rare, meaning, he told citizens they were not just subjects, but actors in a grand design. That their taxes, their conscription, their sacrifices built a legacy larger than any one life. He understood theater, the coronation, the eagle standards, the marble statues. They weren't vanity. They were tools of cohesion, a story every citizen could belong to. Today, politics offers choice. Napoleon offered destiny. His version of leadership was not a seat, it was a storm. And while we may question his methods, we cannot ignore the transformation. France before him was fractured. After him, it was unified, bruised perhaps, but redefined. That is the mark of power not taken, but wielded. Long after Napoleon's cannons fell silent, generals continued to hear their thunder in textbooks, war colleges, and every staff briefing that speaks of tempo, initiative, and decisive maneuver. He did not merely fight battles, he rewired the circuitry of warfare itself. Before him, European armies lumbered in single blocks, tethered to supply depots. Napoleon shattered that paradigm with the corps system, self-contained formations of infantry, cavalry, and artillery that could march separately, live off the land, and converge like fingers closing into a fist at the point of impact. This allowed him to stretch a front across leagues yet still strike with unified force. The concept survives today under different names: task forces, combat arms teams, brigade combat groups. In World War II, German planners studied his lightning marches across Italy and adopted Schwerpunkt, the principle of concentrating overwhelming force at a decisive point. He also mastered interior lines. By marching along roads that radiated from a central hub, he could reinforce threatened sectors quicker than coalitions struggling along the perimeter. Modern strategists call this operational art and teach it with colored arrows on digital maps. Logistics, that prosaic engine of victory, bowed to his will as well. He standardized calibers so artillery pieces shared ammunition. He requisitioned food locally, reducing the ox-drawn wagons that slowed prior armies to a crawl. Yet brilliance invites counter-brilliance. Enemies adapted. Wellington built reverse-slope defenses to hide troops from French guns. Russian commanders traded territory for time, forcing the emperor to chase, extending lines until they snapped in the winter wind. Modern officers still read Gemini and Clausewitz, writers forged in the Napoleonic furnace, for concepts like center of gravity, culminating point, and fog of war. And consider staff procedure. The meticulous briefings of 21st century headquarters, synchronized tables, step-by-step execution matrices, fallback branches, descend from the central planning sessions Napoleon held with Berthier, his chief of staff. He demanded clear intent, flexible orders, decentralized execution long before the phrases filled PowerPoint slides. Even failure proved instructive. The Russian campaign taught posterity the perils of overextension, overconfidence, and climate's unforgiving veto. Every modern logistics officer who stockpiles winter gear in July is, consciously or not, kneeling at the icy lessons of 1812. Thus, while empires crumbled and borders shifted, Napoleon remained on the syllabus. Step away from troop movements and listen instead to the quiet lesson Napoleon whispers to every boardroom, startup garage, and classroom debating the nature of leadership. His biography is a case study in extremes: meteoric ascent, incandescent impact, catastrophic descent. Yet inside that dramatic arc lies a toolkit we can borrow, if we dare to handle it. First, he teaches velocity. Momentum is not a byproduct of success. It is a strategy. In business terms, shipping version 1.0 quickly captures terrain competitors haven't scouted. Napoleon called it marching to the sound of the guns. Second, he teaches narrative. People follow stories more readily than orders. Eagles atop French standards, bulletins praising regiments by name, the mythos of invincibility. These were branding exercises as deliberate as any modern marketing campaign. Third, he teaches proximity. He rode among his men, shared bivouac smoke, and inspected frontline pickets at dawn. In remote work culture, proximity becomes transparency, showing up in Slack threads, answering questions in real time, staying visible. Authority that hides erodes. Fourth, he exposes the cost of unchecked certainty. The same iron will that forged Austerlitz blinded him before Moscow. Confirmation bias, scaling too fast, ignoring dissent. Modern pitfalls echo his. When quarterly growth seduces companies into reckless expansions, they replay the march to Smolensk, just without snow. Fifth, he reminds us of legacy's two faces. His battles are tourist sites, but his administrative code still governs millions. Impact does not require perpetual control. Sometimes it requires clear documentation handed to successors. Finally, he highlights the paradox of ambition. Aim too low and mediocrity calcifies. Aim too high and hubris decays achievement. The sweet spot lies where daring meets self-awareness, a balance Napoleon seldom sustained. His downfall invites reflection. Growth demands brakes as well as accelerators. Boardrooms need contrarians as well as champions. Nations require constitutions that outlast charismatic rulers. So when your own projects loom daunting, launching a nonprofit, finishing a thesis, parenting through uncertainty, remember this Corsican artillery officer who recalibrated continents. Study his leaps forward, annotate his stumbles, and then craft your campaign with humility where he wielded certainty, with collaboration where he imposed command. Because the truest tribute to Napoleon is not imitation but integration, taking the best of audacity, grafting it onto empathy, and marching, eyes open, into battles of our own choosing. Napoleon's influence stretched beyond battlefield and law code. It penetrated culture, reshaping how a society saw itself, how individuals defined greatness, and even how fashion mimicked power. No other military figure since Alexander the Great captured imagination in marble, melody, and manuscript like he did. Portraitists painted him not just as a man but a myth. Jacques-Louis David's canvases elevated Napoleon to an almost divine posture, rearing on horseback over the Alps, or solemnly crowned beneath golden arches, evoking Roman emperors. These weren't mere likenesses. They were propaganda with brushstrokes. His uniform, tight gray coat, bicorn hat angled just so, hand tucked at chest, became an icon. It wasn't vanity, it was branding. Soldiers recognized him from afar, civilians from newspaper sketches. Today, cartoonists need only 2 lines in a hat to signal him. He understood what Silicon Valley calls visual identity centuries before the term existed. Musicians joined in the reverence and rebellion. Beethoven famously dedicated his Third Symphony to Napoleon, calling him the hero of the revolution, until word reached him that Napoleon had crowned himself emperor. In literature, he became both muse and warning. Tolstoy's War and Peace portrayed him as a hollow shell, driven by fate more than genius. Balzac wove Napoleon into background lore, a gravitational force pulling lesser men into ambitious spirals. Victor Hugo, in exile himself, penned laments and criticisms in equal measure. The pen tried to reckon with the sword, and often found itself uncertain. Even fashion knelt before the emperor. Women wore empire waist dresses, high-waisted gowns with flowing fabric beneath the bust, mimicking neoclassical styles Napoleon favored. Men buttoned jackets in imitation of military frock coats. But cultural influence is double-edged. Some saw Napoleon not as a beacon, but a specter. Spanish painters like Goya captured the brutality of his wars. German poets turned their nationalism inward, dreaming not of empires, but of identity. The world admired him, but it also armored itself against the Napoleonic contagion. Centuries later, he appears in games, films, and even memes. Strategy players invoke his name as shorthand for clever offense. Political pundits reference his rise when analyzing populist waves. Students quote his aphorisms. A man who died in 1821 still shapes the imagination in 2025. His cultural immortality proves that power fades slower in memory than in marble. And when we reenact his campaigns, write operas in his honor, or parody his silhouette, we're not just remembering Napoleon. We're reliving our fascination with ambition and charisma. But who was Napoleon, stripped of title and myth? Beneath the medals, between campaigns, behind the marble busts, who was the man who once ruled a continent? He was born not in Paris or Rome, but in Corsica, a rough island recently annexed by France, where loyalty was tribal and accents marked outsiders. As a child, Napoleon was mocked for his poor French and Corsican brogue. These early wounds would scar into drive. If he couldn't belong by birth, he would dominate by merit. At military school in Brienne, he was quiet, intense, often isolated. He read constantly Julius Caesar, Plutarch's Lives, Machiavelli. His notebooks reveal a mind drawn to systems, obsessed with control. He played chess, not for amusement, but for study. Moves and counter-moves. He saw life as a battlefield, every conversation a campaign. In love, he was erratic. His letters to Josephine are volcanic, jealous, poetic, impulsive. He idolized her, then scorned her, then returned to her in memory after betrayal. He sought in women not just affection, but stability, something elusive to men who live at the edge of history. His friendships were transactional. He rewarded loyalty with meteoric promotions, but discarded those who failed him without ceremony. Berthier Marat, nay, praised one year, punished the next. He trusted no one fully, not even family. Bloodlines were tools. Brothers became kings by his decree, and scapegoats by his needs. Yet those who met him spoke of an aura. His eyes held storms. He could speak to a crowd of thousands and make each feel personally addressed. He read people like maps, saw their weaknesses, their needs, their fears, and used them. His charisma was not charm, it was gravity. He worked obsessively, slept little, dictated memos at midnight, reviewed logistics down to boot sizes. On campaign, he might ride for hours, then dictate strategy without pause. In private, he played solitaire or read dramas. He adored theater, perhaps because it mirrored his own life. Staged, dramatic, always under scrutiny. Was he happy? That's harder to say. He knew triumph, he knew grandeur. But joy, it flickers in his writings, rarely glows. He feared irrelevance more than defeat. His exile on Elba, and later St. Helena, crushed him not because of comfort lost, but because the audience was gone. To be Napoleon was to be constantly performing, and perhaps to forget eventually, where the mask ended and the man began. There is something deeply modern about Napoleon's contradictions. He was a revolutionary who crowned himself emperor, a liberator who became a conqueror, a visionary who trusted no one's vision but his own. In today's world of branding, disruption, and personal empires built on charisma, Napoleon feels eerily familiar. Influencers stage authenticity. Startups promise transformation. Politicians invoke destiny. Napoleon did it first, with cannons and decrees instead of hashtags and press conferences. His leadership style, centralized, fast-moving, top-down, foreshadows the executive culture of our time. His famous maxim, "If you want a thing done well, do it yourself," could adorn the wall of any tech founder. Yet his failures, burnout, overreach, isolation, are also cautionary tales. He ran an empire like a startup on perpetual launch mode, always expanding, always innovating, never pausing. But empires, like companies, require redundancy, delegation, long-term planning. Napoleon mastered the sprint, not the marathon. His downfall was seated in the very skills that made him rise. He centralized too much, ignored dissent, and mistook momentum for sustainability. These are pitfalls every modern leader must face, especially those seduced by early success. Yet he endures as a symbol, because even when he failed audaciously. He dared to redraw the map, challenge tradition, and embody force of will. In a world often dominated by mediocrity, such ambition, however flawed, resonates. And perhaps that is his truest legacy. Not the borders he changed or the battles he won, but the scale of his reach. He shows what a single human, driven, disciplined, and utterly convinced, can accomplish against the inertia of the world. Napoleon reminds us that greatness is not the absence of failure, but the willingness to aim beyond convention. As Napoleon's story narrows toward its end, we're drawn to a more personal theater, not of parades and palace gates, but of memory, mortality, and the strange stillness that follows a life lived at war with time. On St. Helena, the ocean whispered a truth that had long eluded him. Empires vanish. Echoes fade. But memory endures if shaped properly. And so, in that rocky exile, Napoleon began one final campaign, not for land, but for legacy. He dictated memoirs, not dispatches. He examined the past with the same intensity he once gave to terrain and troop movements. Each word, each revision, was a soldier on the field of history. He wanted the world to remember him as the embodiment of reason, ambition, order, not merely as a man of war, but a man of vision. He spoke endlessly of the Code Napoleon, of educational reform, of secular administration. His version of history made him not just the architect of victory, but of civilization. The British governor who oversaw his captivity called him restless, cunning, at times charming, at other times unbearable. But even those who disliked him found it hard not to be drawn into his gravity. He still held court, even in defeat. Visitors left with stories. Letters described his sharp mind, his occasional melancholy, his appetite for conversation. He was no longer an emperor, but he remained a force. As illness progressed, the myth grew bolder in his own telling. He spoke of betrayals, of missed opportunities, of fate. His greatest victories grew even grander in retelling. His defeats became circumstantial. The island became a stage. The script, written and revised, was one he hoped the world would memorize. When death finally came, it was quiet. No drums, no cheers, no banners. Just wind, just the slow breath of a man who had once made history gallop. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte died. Alone, far from his birthplace, far from the marble halls of the Tuileries, far from the roar of cannon fire and the echoes of Vive l'Empereur. But his story didn't end there. It couldn't, because Napoleon had done something few humans manage. He had sculpted himself into a legend, one sentence at a time. What does Napoleon mean today? That's the question history quietly poses when we trace his footsteps or speak his name. He is not just a figure of the past. He is a mirror for power, for ambition, for the fragile balance between vision and vanity. In classrooms, he is studied. In war colleges, he is dissected. In politics, he is referenced, both as warning and as aspiration. Some call him a genius, others a tyrant. Few call him forgettable. In him, we see the paradox of greatness. He rose from obscurity through sheer will. No noble blood, no inherited crown. He mastered the language of the Enlightenment, merit, reason, law, and then used it to build an empire that contradicted its own ideals. His rise teaches us about mobility, about how systems, even rigid ones, can be outwitted by the relentless. His fall teaches humility. No matter how towering the legacy, history has a long memory and little mercy. Napoleon invites us to consider scale, not just of ambition, but of impact. One man, shaped by books and battles, reshaped a continent. How many borders exist today because of him? How many legal codes echo his reforms? How many ideas, whispered centuries later, still carry the rhythm of his proclamations? But perhaps what endures most is the emotional core of his story, the desire to matter, to leave a mark, to craft something so lasting that even in death, one's name rides with the wind. In that, he is not unlike us. He simply aimed higher, climbed faster, and fell harder. Napoleon's life is both a blueprint and a caution. It shows us what is possible and what it costs. Not everyone should follow it, but no one can ignore it. In many ways, Napoleon's final conquest was not of land, but of memory. He understood something fundamental. History is not merely what happened. It is what is remembered and how it is told. That is why, long after his cannons fell silent, his narrative roared louder than ever. He knew the world would write about him. So, he began to write first. His memoirs painted him as a hero misunderstood, a reformer betrayed, a man out of time. He chose his phrases like battle plans. He cut enemies from the story, inserted glory where there was doubt, and always, always remained central in the frame. This is the lesson modern leaders and storytellers quietly absorb. That myth is a form of immortality. That if you can control the narrative, you never truly vanish. But myths are double-edged. They inspire, yes, but they also demand. They turn men into symbols and strip away nuance. Napoleon the myth cannot fail, cannot bleed, cannot wonder. But the man did all three. He bled on battlefields. He failed at diplomacy. He wondered whether the crown was worth the solitude it brought. And maybe that is the final lesson, that to be remembered is not to be understood. We can recount his dates, recite his victories, sketch his profile, but we will never fully know what it felt like to carry the weight he chose. We stand at a distance, like spectators in a museum, gazing up at the marble, forgetting that the statue was once flesh, ambition, and fear. And so we come to the end of our march alongside Napoleon. Through Corsican hills, Parisian corridors, icy Russian fields, and lonely ocean cliffs, we followed the footsteps of a man who refused to walk softly. What makes him unforgettable is not just what he achieved, but how completely he lived within the urgency of his own time. He did not wait. He did not hope. He moved, always forward, always faster than the world around him expected. In an age where we often hesitate, swipe, delay, decide tomorrow, Napoleon reminds us that history belongs to those who act, who dare, who risk. But he also reminds us that such action comes at a cost. Family strained, trust broken, peace elusive. Greatness often leaves wreckage behind it. Still, his story is not merely one of conquest. It is one of transformation. He turned ideas into institutions, chaos into code, and dreams into documents that still bear his name. His shadow stretches not because of its darkness, but because of its depth. In studying him, we study ourselves, our hunger for meaning, our fear of obscurity, our hope that one life can matter beyond its years. As we close this chapter, we do not simply remember Napoleon. We reflect on legacy, on ambition, on time. For in the end, Napoleon Bonaparte was not just a man of his era, he was a mirror for all eras to come. Even after his final breath on St. Helena, Napoleon did not truly vanish. In fact, some would argue his true legacy began only after death. For years, whispers of his return haunted the courts of Europe. Impostors emerged, claiming to be him, feeding a myth more resilient than any crown. His name became a force, not of fear alone, but fascination. Artists painted him as a tragic hero. Writers invoked his name as a metaphor for genius and downfall. In schools across France, boys learned of his campaigns not as history, but legend. And politically, he cast a long shadow. The very idea of republicanism fused with power. It was Napoleon who demonstrated that a man of no noble blood could rise to dominate emperors and kings. Even his enemies absorbed him. The Prussian military, for example, restructured itself based on his strategies. Clausewitz, the famed theorist, wrote much of his philosophy with Napoleon as the implicit subject. The very way we understand modern warfare, centralized command, core structure, rapid mobilization, these weren't just Napoleon's methods, they became the blueprint. And then there's the law, the Napoleonic Code, a dry name perhaps, but monumental in influence. It laid down civil liberties, property rights, and codified legal systems still in use today from Belgium to Egypt to parts of the Americas. It's strange to think, a man who once burned villages in his path is now invoked in constitutional debates. But such was his transformation, from destroyer to founder, from emperor to architect. So we must ask ourselves, how many of our modern rights, our institutions, our very sense of merit and ambition trace back in some way to Napoleon Bonaparte? But for all this talk of systems and legacies, we must return to the man. What made him tick? What fire burned behind those intense eyes, beneath that iconic bicorn hat? Napoleon believed in control, not just of armies, but of fate. He did not wait for history to offer him a role. He seized it. That perhaps is what separates him most from us. He viewed each day as a campaign, each room as a battlefield of ideas. Even in private, he spoke with a tone of command. Even in solitude, he mapped the world. And yet, there was solitude. Letters to Josephine reveal a man capable of tenderness, of longing. He missed her, and later missed France itself. He was not hollow, but layered. He detested boredom. Sleep came late, and never gently. He once said, 6 hours sleep for a man, 7 for a woman, and 8 for a fool. His aides barely kept up, some collapsed from exhaustion. Meals were brief, his attention always elsewhere. One moment discussing taxes, the next, terrain in Bavaria. He demanded speed, precision, loyalty. And yet he loved music. He found beauty in silence, in clarity, in strategy. He could be brutal, but also strangely kind. A child in the street might earn a smile. An officer might face his wrath. This contradiction, warm and cold, builder and breaker, made him fascinating. It makes him still alive in memory. We look at him not just as a general or ruler, but as a mirror. What would we become if we pursued our goals with absolute resolve? That question, perhaps more than any title, is why Napoleon endures. And now, let's pivot, not to the battlefield, nor the palace, but the minds shaped by Napoleon long after his fall. Across Europe, revolutionaries whispered his name, not as a tyrant, but a torchbearer. In Italy, in Poland, in Greece, his image became a symbol of national awakening. Even in exile, he inspired poets. Lord Byron mourned him. Beethoven, who had once dedicated a symphony to him, recoiled when Napoleon crowned himself emperor. Yet the music remained. In America, leaders debated whether Napoleon's centralized systems were a warning or a model. His Louisiana sale doubled the size of the United States. Not bad for a byproduct of imperial overreach. In Africa, his brief Egyptian campaign opened the door to archaeology, Orientalism, and a fascination that would shape Western views of the East for centuries. And let us not forget, it was Napoleon who triggered the rise of nationalism, the idea that a nation is more than its rulers. Ironically, the empire he tried to forge splintered into nations because of him. Some called him the last enlightened monarch. Others, the first modern dictator. Both might be true. But here's the paradox. Napoleon left behind no dynasty, no enduring imperial structure. His family faded, his empire dissolved, and yet he remains. In our books, in our laws, in our dreams of greatness. Because Napoleon, for all his flaws, proved that one person with vision, daring, and relentless motion can change the world. Long after his death, Napoleon did something extraordinary. He evolved, not as flesh, but as story. Like Achilles, like Caesar, he passed from man to myth. Not because history needed another hero, but because it couldn't let him go. In the salons of Paris, old men recounted his march across Europe as if they had followed his banners. In distant colonies, soldiers invoked his name when facing impossible odds. And on the streets, children played at battles, not knights or kings, but generals. Napoleon had given the common man a new role to imagine, not nobility by birth, but leadership by brilliance. That perhaps is his greatest alchemy. He made ambition respectable. He made victory seem possible, even for those without a crown. And though he lost, though he ended his days staring at a distant sea, shackled by memory, people remembered the rise, not the fall. That's the mark of true influence, to lose everything and remain unforgettable. Every age rediscovers Napoleon. The Romantics saw a tragic titan. The Victorians, a cautionary tale. In the 20th century, generals pored over his tactics. Psychologists probed his ego. Novelists borrowed his arc. And yet, the man at the center of it all remains elusive. His writings contradict his actions. His policies defy ideology. He ruled with iron, yet spoke of enlightenment. He crowned himself, yet dreamed of liberty. Maybe that's why he endures. He cannot be boxed in, not by history books, not by marble statues. He is the riddle of power made flesh, daring and dreadful, brilliant and brutal, always advancing. And so, the world turns, and we still speak his name, not in fear, but in fascination. But what if Napoleon had lived longer? What if St. Helena had been just another exile, not the final chapter? It is a question that teases historians and haunts the imagination. Would he have returned again like a phoenix? Could the tide of history have shifted once more at the force of his will? Or had the world already moved on, its appetite for empires finally sated? The truth is, Napoleon's greatest acts came not from circumstance, but from audacity. He didn't wait for opportunity. He created it, with speed, with surprise, with sheer conviction. That's the lesson modern minds still chase. In business, in politics, in war, the Napoleonic mindset still applies. Decide quickly, move faster, accept risk, shape events before they shape you. But here's what few remember: the cost. For every victory, there were villages scorched. For every triumphal arch, a battlefield soaked in blood. And in the end, perhaps the world didn't need another empire. It needed a pause, a reckoning. And so, the Allies sent him away, not just to stop a man, but to preserve a fragile peace. But exile cannot erase memory. The people remembered. The soldiers remembered. And with time, even the victor softened. When his remains were returned to Paris in 1840, crowds lined the streets. Veterans wept. Young men saluted. They brought him home not as a criminal, but as a son of France. That day, it was not politics that won, but story. The story of a boy from Corsica who dared to rule the world, and nearly did. So what does Napoleon mean today, in a world of satellites, screens, and democracies? Can the life of one man, born in 1769, still resonate in 2025? The answer lies not in the cannons or the campaigns, but in the current of ambition. In a world overwhelmed by choice, Napoleon reminds us of commitment. In a time paralyzed by indecision, he models momentum. We don't need emperors, we don't need conquest, but we do need vision, we need courage and clarity. He reminds us that greatness isn't reserved for the chosen few. It is carved by those who dare, who act, who refuse to be ordinary. And maybe, just maybe, that's the real legacy. Not the empire, not the marble tomb, but the spark he lit in the human spirit. Napoleon dared to ask, why not me? And through him, others began to ask the same. That ripple, more than any battle, still moves through time. From revolutions to reforms, from classrooms to boardrooms, his name echoes. Not as a call to war, but as a challenge to live deliberately. To move with intent, to speak with force, to leave something behind. Because in the end, the question isn't whether we match Napoleon's power, it's whether we live our own story with half as much purpose. Napoleon never wrote a guide on leadership. He never held seminars or recorded manifestos. Yet across centuries, leaders have studied his moves like scripture, dissecting battles, strategies, and speeches, hoping to borrow his fire. What made him different wasn't just knowledge. It was conviction. He believed so completely in his destiny that others followed, not out of duty, but awe. He walked into rooms and changed their temperature. He entered courts filled with aristocrats and made them feel like children, because he had seen blood, made decisions that ended empires, survived betrayals, exiles, and reversals. He didn't theorize power, he lived it. That rawness, that intensity, it's rare. Most modern leaders are taught to soften, to hedge, to balance. Napoleon didn't balance. He tilted the world toward his vision. And even in defeat, his influence endured. Generals in 2 world wars studied his campaigns. Revolutionaries quoted him. CEOs mimicked his decisiveness. His fingerprints, invisible yet unmistakable, rest on the blueprints of strategy and leadership across the globe. But with power came peril. His belief in himself grew so vast, it consumed perspective. He stopped listening. He made errors not from ignorance, but from certainty. That, too, is part of the lesson. Greatness can become a trap when unchecked. The same qualities that make a man rise can hasten his fall. And so, when modern minds reach for his example, they must grasp both edges of the blade, the brilliance and the blindness, the command and the consequences. Because to understand Napoleon is to understand ambition at its brightest and its most dangerous. Strip away the uniforms, set aside the battles, forget the titles, and there remains something deeper, Napoleon as a mirror. He reflects what we long for and what we fear, the desire to rise, the hunger to matter, the terror of irrelevance. His story is not just France's, it's humanity's. A story of rising from nothing, of bending fate, of leaving behind a name etched in time. That's why people return to him, not for strategy, but for meaning. He lived in a world where fate was usually sealed by birth, but he rewrote his, from the son of a Corsican lawyer to the ruler of an empire. It was more than a career. It was a revolution in what a single life could be. And yet, with all that he gained, he never found peace. Not truly. His mind raced even in silence. He planned campaigns in exile. He debated history with his captors. Even dying, he dictated, trying to edit the final version of himself. That unrest, it's familiar. We chase goals, build legacies, seek validation, and often, like Napoleon, we struggle to rest, as if stillness were surrender. But perhaps that is his unintended gift. A caution not just of ambition, but of excess. A reminder that greatness must be balanced with humanity. That movement, no matter how grand, must one day find a place to stop. And in that moment, not in battle, but in reflection, we may finally understand who we really are. Imagine for a moment Napoleon living among us, not in uniform, but in modern clothes, not commanding armies, but navigating a world of algorithms, brands, and instant connection. Would his ambition still shine? Would his certainty hold in a time of endless information and constant feedback? Or would the world dull his edge? Perhaps he would adapt. He was, after all, a master of reinvention. Perhaps he'd lead a movement or redefine a technology. Perhaps he'd still rise, not by the sword, but by vision. Because his true weapon wasn't artillery, it was imagination. He imagined a France transformed, a Europe united, a life unbound by station. He imagined possibility, and then pursued it with relentless force. That's the trait that remains timeless. In every generation, we need people who refuse to accept limits, who look at the world and say, it can be more, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. That spirit of building, of daring, of striving is not just his. It belongs to anyone bold enough to try. And so, whether you stand in a boardroom or sit quietly wondering what your life could become, remember him. Not as an emperor, not as a myth, but as a reminder that one life lived with fierce purpose can echo through time. Napoleon's story doesn't end with exile or even with death, because history is not made of endings, it is made of echoes, and his echo is still with us. Not just in books or statues, but in the questions we ask ourselves. What does it mean to lead? To rise? To fall? To matter? He didn't invent ambition, but he gave it shape. A Corsican boy, mocked for his accent, stepped onto history's stage and made the world adjust to his presence. That force of will, so raw, so rare, it's what we remember. And yet, for all his power, he could not escape the laws of time. His empire faded, his enemies grew. His victories became dates, studied in classrooms, stripped of fire. But then, you read a letter he wrote, or see a painting of his coronation, or stand beneath the dome at Les Invalides where his sarcophagus rests. And suddenly, the distance collapses. You don't just remember history, you feel it. That's the power of a life fully lived. It pulls others into its orbit, long after it's gone. In today's world, we're told to be cautious, to avoid risks, to play it safe. But Napoleon's life whispers something else. Take the leap. Dare the impossible. Even if you fall, fall with force. Because in the end, history remembers the bold. And not because they won, but because they tried to do something greater than themselves. What did Napoleon see in his final moments? Was it the cliffs of Corsica? The banks of the Seine? The silent fields of Waterloo? Or the quiet garden at St. Helena? We don't know. His last words were debated. Some say he whispered names. Others say he called for his army, his son, his past. But maybe he saw what he had built. Not just cities or codes, but the idea that one man could rise above his birth, above his limits, above history itself. That idea, once planted, never leaves us. It stirs in the heart of every dreamer, every person told they're too small, too late, too much. It reminds us that change doesn't always come from the expected place. Sometimes it comes from a small island, a restless spirit, a voice that says, "Why not me?" Napoleon wasn't perfect. He was deeply flawed. He was proud, impatient, and at times ruthless. But he was alive in a way most of us only dream of being. And that is why we remember him. Not because he ruled, but because he dared. And in daring, he gave permission to the rest of us to want more, to be more, to live, not merely exist. Imagine a version of yourself stripped of comfort, no phones, no safety net, no applause, just your will, your grit, your mind. That was Napoleon's world, a world of cold nights and tents, of horses and hunger, of maps scrawled by candlelight, of decisions made in moments that shaped centuries. He didn't wait for perfect conditions. He acted, he failed, he adapted, and most of all, he kept going. What would happen if we lived like that? Not as conquerors, but as creators. What if we treated our lives as campaigns, not of war, but of purpose? What if we planned our days like strategies, built our relationships like alliances, fought our fears like battles? Napoleon reminds us that time is short, that history is impatient, that the world waits for no one. But also, that one person, with focus, can leave a mark bigger than their body, longer than their life. It doesn't take a throne, it takes intention, and the courage to move. Because while Napoleon's era may be gone, the challenge he poses still stands. What will you do with your time? Thank you for walking through this journey, not just of a man, but of an idea. Napoleon's life invites us to reflect, to challenge, to imagine, not to glorify conquest, but to understand the cost of ambition and the weight of legacy. In every age, we need reminders like him, reminders that boldness changes things, that vision can overpower odds, that greatness comes with sacrifice. We hope this story stirred something in you, a thought, a question, a fire. And as this narration draws to a close, we invite you to take that spark and carry it forward, into your work, your days, your life. If you have thoughts, reflections, or stories of your own, we'd love to hear them. Your perspective shapes the next chapter of history. Until then, thank you for listening. And remember, time is the greatest empire we'll ever rule. Make it count.